In October 2023, Dr. Ben Thomson, a nephrologist at a hospital just north of Toronto, was suspended from his job, had his life threatened, and his address shared online, all for his social media posts. Dr. Ben Thomson has taught and volunteered as a doctor inside Gaza and the occupied West Bank since 2013, and he joins me now on the line. Dr. Thomson, welcome.
Thanks so much for having me, Samira.
Thank you for joining me. Now, I don't want to spend too much time on this, but a lot of our listeners and viewers don't know exactly what happened to you back in October of 2023. So if you could just briefly take us through the story of what happened while you were working at the hospital.
Yeah, I mean, really, that story starts in 2013 because I've been going to Gaza since 2013, once or twice a year, teaching in the medical schools, developing programs, but also, you know, many of the people who are in healthcare in Gaza have become friends of mine. Many have become good friends of mine, and unfortunately, many of them have been killed since October of this year. I was in Gaza as part of my regular annual visits in September of 2023. During that time, I was teaching at the Islamic University of Gaza, which I do every year, as well as talking to some of the physicians to help to develop training programs. This also stems from some of my clinical work where I personally witnessed war crimes committed by Israel, not only in the Great March of Return protests of 2018 and 2019, but I also served in the emergency room and in clinical areas during other rounds of Israeli aggression, in which I saw, again, more evidence of war crimes. So with that experience in hand, when October happened, I had literally just left in late September, and almost immediate, it was very obvious that there was an astounding level of dehumanizing rhetoric against Palestinian people. There were media groups that were sharing things that should have been known to be false, or things that simply weren't being verified before being broadcast. So a couple examples include the 40 beheaded babies being placed in ovens, mass rape. I mean, certainly there were atrocities committed on October 7th. However, what was concerning to me was almost immediately afterwards, we were seeing Israel cutting off water, cutting off food, massive amounts of dehumanizing rhetoric on a path to genocide, which is exactly what we're currently seeing. I recognized that immediately, and having seen war crimes myself, I had actually followed up on a social media post by one of Canada's Israel lobby groups, CACJA, CIJA, and they had actually posted.
That's the sorry for those who don't know. That's the Center for Israeli Jewish Advocacy here in Canada.
That's right. That's right. And that Israel lobby group had posted a response to the Member of Parliament Sarah Jama's post, in which she was providing context regarding October 7th. Context which includes and is important to understand that this October 7th did not happen in isolation. It happened in the context of decades-long illegal occupation, expansion of settlements, extensive war crimes, extensive declarations of the United Nations that have gone unresponded, and really decades and decades of Israel dehumanizing the Palestinian people. And Sarah Jama, our Member of Parliament, provided some context to that, and almost immediately was branded a terrorist, in part by the Israel lobby group that complained quite loudly, and then again rebroadcast some of these lies and some of the Israel propaganda, including beheaded babies. In response to that, I called them out, and I said, I basically talked about the fact that Israel was already committing war crimes.
You said it was a lie. I mean,
Yeah.
their post about the 40 beheaded babies.
Yeah.
So, and that's the social media post that got your life threatened. And
Yeah, so that was the post that almost immediately two Israel lobby groups in Canada, both CACJA and B'nai B'rith, contacted my hospital. I understand they contacted my CEO by telephone and by letter. There was a letter writing campaign that was meant to complain about my position on Israel. There was a threat called in, and ultimately, I was suspended. Within 24 hours of that, I was suspended.
I just want to read. I just want to read this message because I have it here.
Yeah.
This was the message sent to the hospital. This message is for Dr. Ben Thomson. Remove your post regarding Israel. It is disgusting. You are a disgusting human being. You do not know what you're saying, and if you do not remove it, I advise you and the rest of your staff to stay out of your office. That is really that is a level of menacing and threatening that is unheard of. And
Well,
so
I mean,
instead,
yeah.
and the backlash came to you.
Yeah, I mean, there's two parts to that I think that really need to be considered. The first is that it's important to note that the criticism was saying I said something against Israel, right? So this isn't, the threats weren't because it was considered anti-Semitic. It was considered I was making a statement against Israel. And I admit I was making a statement against Israel. I think at this point, most of us should be making statements against Israel's conduct. So I think that's the first part that's important. The second part is that while initially we didn't understand the severity of the threats, I fully cooperated with the York Regional Police, who very quickly explained to me that this was a low-level threat, and other than a few common sense recommendations, they, with regards to safety of my house, they didn't make any further recommendations, and I was able to go back to my house almost right away. And they made no recommendations with regards to my workplace and had no problem with me continuing to work there. So, I didn't know that at the time until I talked to the York Regional Police. Obviously, I didn't know, I don't have experience with this sort of thing. So it's hard for me to gauge, what these threats mean as far as the severity and the actual risk. But the actual risk was deemed to be quite low, thankfully. That being said, the hospital chose to suspend me regardless. And that came soon after a meeting I actually had with leadership. Before I was suspended, I had a meeting with the leadership in which they instructed me, they gave me two options, neither of which included suspension. One of them was I had the option to take a leave of absence. Now, that was a uncertain duration. I may or may not be getting paid. What would happen during that period of time was not stated. That didn't seem all that favorable to me, given that it seemed the only reason why I would be off at this point would be for them simply disagreeing with my position on Israel. The other alternative was to wait, continue to work, and to bring it up at the Medical Advisory Committee, which is the standard procedure with which these sorts of things usually are dealt with. I chose that route. That normally would mean that 2 weeks from that time, I would have a meeting with some hospital leadership, at which point I would have the ability to plead my case. Instead of being provided that opportunity, the hospital suspended me in less than 24 hours.
And how long did that suspension last?
So I was off work for a month. Yeah. And
then just came back after? I mean,
no, I went to it ended up I had to go to the Medical Advisory Committee anyways. And an agreement was made at which I was allowed to come back to work. Ultimately, at that point, it would have been ridiculous for anyone not to see that I was suspended for my views on Israel. Everyone should at that point have appreciated that. I think people within the hospital, there were a lot of people who were very upset about that. There was a mass email campaign of over 100,000 emails that went to the hospital leadership saying that what they did was disgusting. And understandably, the hospital had a lot of pressure, and ultimately my suspension was lifted. Unfortunately, there were tens of thousands of dollars spent on legal expenses for my defense, which was really completely unnecessary. So that was my experience. And I obviously had some dark days, but the reality is, if I put it in context, my worst day in the last 10 months is still better than, the best day of anyone in Gaza. And really, that's
Yeah.
that's the important thing. Um,
But I do want to get to Gaza because I just want to go back a bit. That you said you were there in September of 2023, so this is a
yeah,
month before the October 7th attacks. What was the healthcare system like there then?
yeah. I mean, it's struggling even at baseline. From a public health perspective, Gaza is in a crisis even at baseline, even prior to October of 2023. So you're talking about a population where 50% of adults are unemployed, in large part due to the economic blockade and the lack of economic opportunities because of the blockade imposed by Israel. Um, Malnutrition in children at baseline is very high. There's massively high rates of anemia, malnutrition. In general, about 1 in 3 children at baseline is suffering from malnutrition in Gaza before October 2023, and 1 in 2 has anemia. Food insecurity is exceptionally high at about 50% at baseline, and about 80% of the population is reliant on humanitarian aid at baseline. Um, 97% of water is undrinkable in the taps there at baseline. And that's, now we multiply that and say, well, all of water is undrinkable. And not only is it undrinkable, but it's unavailable, right? Typically, we have a standard in humanitarian health which says, the bare minimum a person needs to survive with basic needs and necessities of water is about 30 liters a day. And when I was there in March, the average person in Gaza had less than 2 liters a day. That's simply not survivable. You can't clean your clothes, make food, drink water. You can't do that with 2 liters a day. You simply can't. And so what I saw instead was people who were in Mawazi. I happened to be in the south of
Mm.
Gaza for a good part of the time I was there in March. People in Mawazi, tent
This is
city.
this is an area where there is no infrastructure whatsoever. This was a
Exactly.
place that they had pushed people to. This is where that massive inferno happened also,
Yeah. Yeah.
of the tents. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. So about 2 million people were displaced. And when we say displacement, we typically think of one mass movement, but it hasn't been one mass movement in Gaza. It's been multiple. So just to give you an example, one of the healthcare workers I worked with, Dima, I worked with her in a clinic, a wound care clinic in the south where I met her. She's actually a fourth year medical student. And at the wound care clinic, she was already, her skills as far as suturing would be better than most second year general surgery residents in Canada. She picked it up really, really quick. But chatting with her, I mean, what an amazing young woman. So her family was actually from northern Gaza. They lived pretty close to the Indonesian hospital, which has been destroyed, but they were initially displaced from the north to Gaza City, and then they went Gaza City to Deir al-Bala, and then they went Deir al-Bala to Rafah, and that's when I met her. And since they were actually in the tent city in Rafah, they were living in a tent very close to the clinic where she was working at. And since I've left in March, she's now actually been displaced again, her and her family, back to the central part of Gaza. So most of the people who've been there have been displaced multiple times. When I saw the tent city in southern Rafah, what was most striking to me was the complete lack of any infrastructure. Um, like I said, water was on average about 2 to 3 liters a day, which is less than 10% of the international standard. As far as toilets went, there was about one toilet for every 1,500 people. And it was
Only
essentially a concrete.
wow,
Yeah,
wow,
yeah.
wow.
Yeah, and I mean, this is what happens when displacement happens on a massive scale, and non-government organizations or charities are highly limited, as well as humanitarian aid blockade.
Well, they're being killed. I
Yeah,
mean,
and they're being killed. Yeah,
yeah,
exactly, exactly. So,
yeah.
so I mean, the ability to set up this infrastructure is also very, very limited. So, I mean, what I saw, children, most of whom had no shoes, would go down to the water, and the very same water in which they would shower, they would also clean their clothes. And then 20 feet from there would be the toilet.
While we're seeing all the skin diseases, I mean, are you in any way surprised that type 2 polio has made an appearance
Not
there?
a bit. And in fact, there were warnings of this as early as November. Um, the multiple charities were mentioning, we're going to see cholera, we're going to see massive diarrhea and skin outbreaks and hepatitis A. And we've seen all of that, right? Hepatitis A was rampant everywhere. I was like in March when I was there, it got to the point where it was so common they weren't even doing diagnostic tests for it. People would come in with jaundice and they would say, oh, it's probably Hep A. There'd be no diagnostic tests for it, but it was just so common. That's 25 to 30% of the people who were coming into clinic were because of hepatitis A. And that just reflects the complete destruction of civilian
Infrastructure.
infrastructure, right? I mean, not just houses, but we're also talking about water and sanitation, completely destroyed by Israel, and due to the inability to open up the borders to humanitarian aid, that's not being reconstructed.
I was speaking with your colleague, Dr. Yipeng Ji,
Mhm.
last month, who worked at a clinic in Rafah, and he said to me, just want to get this quote. He said, "I've learned more about humanity and health and life in Gaza than I have in all my years of studying and practicing medicine anywhere else."
Yeah.
But what has it been like for you to witness firsthand the things that we see, on our screens, on our phones?
Yeah, I mean, I sort of think of things in narratives. Um, there's been a number of patients that have specifically left a sort of indelible mark on me, in large part because it reflects the humanity of Palestinians, but also the lack of humanity of people outside Palestine. One in particular I'm happy to share. I was in Deir al-Bala in Al-Aqsa Hospital in March, and there was a mass casualty event. The mass casualty event typically means multiple victims, often due to a bombing of a civilian building, or apartment building or something to that effect. And so in this case, there was a housing structure that was bombed close to the hospital, and so about, I'd say, probably 12 or 13 victims all came in at once requiring acute care. Now, the hospital, many areas around the hospital had been bombed, and so families who had already been displaced, many of them were living on the hospital grounds, around the hospital in tents. Some of, in fact, had moved into the hallways or even to the emergency room where they lived.
Because you
So,
think you're safe in a hospital.
which we now know clearly isn't the case, right? But many of these family members were living in the hospital, which made provision of care almost impossible because you're trying to provide care to a dozen, very unstable patients, literally in the same space where you have displaced people trying to live. One victim of this Israeli bombing in particular just strikes me as a failure of our humanity. He was a young man. He was probably about 15 or 16 years old, and I met him because he was on the floor of the emergency room. And if I looked at his head from the left side, his ear, like the explosion had been hit by a piece of shrapnel, and his head was open. So I basically could see into his brain. This is considered a fatal injury. Now, he was technically still alive, so he was still breathing, but we had to make the decision what to do with this young man. And so, I mean, I think of what would happen in Canada or the United States if this sort of case happened. Well, there'd be a pathway. Immediately, it would be recognized that this type of injury was not survivable, that the tragedy of a young man being killed this way necessitated us as a healthcare system to provide some dignity. So in this situation, someone like this should be moved into a private room where family members, loved ones could visit. A religious person, in this case an imam, could be with this person in the last remaining hours of his life. Now that sort of dignity is impossible in Gaza. It doesn't exist. It's not possible. So what we did instead is we moved this young man to a corner of a room where there was a curtain. And we put the curtain on one side of him. He was on the opposite side, and he died alone, literally in a puddle of his own blood and brain matter.
In pain too.
In
I mean,
pain. Yeah,
yeah.
absolutely. And I mean, there's that's literally the most dignity we could offer him, and that's not dignified at all. I'm ashamed to even share that story, right? Because as a healthcare provider, I feel like we have failed. If that sort of situation has been allowed to happen, we failed, right? And why has that happened? Well, it's happened because of mass displacement, destruction of hospitals, destruction of civilian infrastructure, ethnic cleansing, and genocide. Those are the reasons why that situation has been unable to happen. And I happen to be working at that hospital only for a couple days. You know, people who are healthcare workers in Gaza, they have seen this every single day for like almost 350 days.
How are they surviving? I mean, some of these people I've watched, all of a sudden they see their own family members coming in. How are they surviving day to day? Most of them are not being paid. They're not. I mean, this is they're working night and day. It seems like.
Yeah, I mean, I think of actually Talat. So an amazing man that I met. Actually, he was a hospital director in a hospital in the central part of Gaza that was initially bombarded, then destroyed by Israel, and so he had to leave. And he and his family were displaced south, and they ended up in Rafah. And they actually were in Rafah only a few weeks prior to my arriving. They had initially lived in a tent, but a bomb had killed 3 of his 4 children and his wife while he was at work. And so he ended up living in the office of another hospital's head administrator. Both he and his son lived there. And I chatted with him probably every day, just because after we would come back to the hospitals where we slept, we would go and we would sit in the administrator's office and we would chat. So every day I had a conversation with Talat. I even went to his grave, his wife's grave, which, I mean, it's obscene. The graveyard. It's literally, there's a tent city, and then immediately adjacent to it is a absolutely enormous graveyard. And they have 2 sections. One section is dedicated to children. And many of the graves in that area have 3 or even 4 members of the same family's children buried in the tent city. It's literally it's obscene. And I spent one evening there with Talat, where he went to the grave of his children. 3 of his children were buried in the same plot. But I asked him, I said, how do you do it? Because he was going to work literally every single day. And the day after his children were killed, he went to work. Like, I can't imagine being able to function, wow. But he went to work. And I asked him a little bit about it, because part of me thought that was a little insensitive, but I talked to him about it, and he provided me a different perspective. To him, it was his form of resistance. To him, he thought that, I'm not going to allow Israel to be satisfied by me not serving my people. My form of resistance is serving my people.
Well,
and so, I mean, there's such a raw humanity and beauty to that. I mean, it's something that I think North Americans would struggle with. A level of humanity. And when I think of every time the Palestinian people have been challenged, they have confirmed over and over and over again that they are the champions of humanity. They've confirmed it over and over and over again. But they've also reminded us that it's our responsibility to uphold that too. And I think as a healthcare profession in general, we haven't done that.
I want to get to that, because one of the questions that I had for you was, why you think there hasn't been this collective outcry from doctors, from nurses around the world for their colleagues in Gaza. I mean, we've had hundreds of healthcare workers killed, some of them targeted. I mean, directors of hospitals, surgeons. And right now there's, I think the number is 147. Amnesty International recently put out a report saying 147 healthcare workers have been kidnapped and are being held and are being held by Israel. But why do you think there hasn't been this outcry?
I don't understand the reason for the complicity. I really don't. At this point, there is no excuse. If we think about previous genocides and what enabled it to happen, one of the leading contributors was silence of leaders. I think of the fact that it took almost no time for the Canadian Medical Association to put out a statement talking about how they are in solidarity with our Iranian health leaders or our Ukrainian health leaders. They actually went as far as saying Russia had committed crimes, which I'm sure they had. But it took them almost no time to state that. Now, in comparison, the severity of the attacks in Gaza are a multiple worse. As far as the number of children killed, more children have been killed in Gaza than all of the other conflicts combined.
It's mind-boggling.
And they haven't had the audacity to say, we care about Palestinian children being killed. They can't even they can't even say that, right? It's disgusting, really. If it's not for the fact that over 500 healthcare workers have been killed, are you not in solidarity with your Palestinian healthcare colleagues? What about the fact that over 100 of them have been captured and tortured? Some of them even killed. We know Adnan al-Bush.
Yes.
Right? There's currently multiple heads of hospitals being held for the crime of being a physician. Right? And our healthcare authorities in Canada and the United States remain silent. It's actually quite disgusting.
I always wonder how these institutions think they're going to recover from this silence that they have. Like, how are you going to, because I have to tell you honestly, it's not just the healthcare, right? I mean, you know this very well. You were suspended, but we've had artists be suspended. We've had people lose their book launches. Professors have been fired. I mean, this is just a whole, hurly-burly of people. Really, it's McCarthyism 3.0. And I always wonder what these institutions are thinking as they silence their colleagues, as they silence the people who are their members. How do you think you're going to recover from this exactly?
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And, I talked about this a little bit a few days ago with a friend of mine. We were chatting a little bit about red lines, right? And I think as a politician or as an institution or as a humanitarian, we all conceptualize that something might need to happen for us to do something, right? As a humanitarian, I might say like, well, I'm never going to donate money, or I'm never going to talk to my MP or go to a protest or put myself at risk. I'm never going to do that unless this happens, right? There's always a unless this happens, right? And so I think about, well, what is this happens? What is that? Well, this has already happened, right? Like this.
We're in it.
If it's not genocide, then you don't have a red line, right? Like as an institution, if a genocide is happening and you're remaining silent, then there are no circumstances in which you have the moral authority to speak about anything. And that's the stage we're at with these complicit Canadian Medical Association organizations that are just not saying anything. And it's not because they don't know. It's not because they haven't been pushed. We sent a letter. Dozens of doctors signed a letter saying, like, why aren't you speaking up about this? Why aren't you using your institutional power and support to put an end to this genocide? And we received no reply.
How about the letter that you wrote to the Prime Minister? You and other doctors here in Canada sent a letter asking the government to do certain things, like stop sending arms, call for an immediate cease, like the very basics.
Very basic things. And, I must admit, even as a group, there were, a couple dozen healthcare workers who'd been to Gaza since the first delegation actually went in December. But there's been a couple dozen that have gone since December of 2023 to Gaza and seen the genocide with their own eyes. And we discussed internally, like, what do we want to include on that demand list? And those were the demands that we agreed to, right? We certainly could have made greater demands. Absolutely, we could have. Many of the people who are amongst that group of a couple dozen healthcare workers had actually already met once and some multiple times with the Prime Minister's office in November. And then I met them actually in November with a number of other people who were in that group. And at that time, it was very obvious that their decisions at the United Nations were not going to align with having any meaningful anti-genocide stance. And that we would need to have additional pressure in other ways. The purpose of that letter was to say, look, we have now dozens of healthcare workers who've been to Gaza. We haven't just been to Gaza, but we've been to many humanitarian conflicts around the world. And Gaza is like something else. Gaza has struck the most experienced humanitarians and said, this is something like nothing we've ever seen. And we communicated that in a letter to the Prime Minister's office and the office of Melanie Joly. And again, that was followed up multiple times with contacts to their office. That was very well communicated on social media. We know they know, and still their choice is silence.
No response.
Their choice is complicity. And that's consistently been their choice, right? So, I think many of us within that group of a couple dozen physicians recognize that there are mechanisms to end this genocide. And we will continue to pressure our politicians. We will continue to pressure our medical organizations. That needs to continue. But in addition, what many of us have now been doing is also providing testimony to the International Criminal Court and the International Court of Justice. And that is not only for South Africa's case of genocide against Israel, but there's multiple other cases, including the UK case, which has recently been quite popular in the news. Many of us, Al-Haq human rights organization, actually was charging some UK politicians with genocide in that case. And I suspect in large part because of those testimonies, the UK has announced that they have ended several dozen arms contracts with Israel.
30, yeah. So they suspended 30 of 350, right. I think it was.
That's right. And certainly there's a lot more to be done there. It's a start, but a lot more needs to be done. Absolutely.
It's still something that we've never seen, right? And so I think that is something. And you mentioned that the university that you were teaching in Gaza, the Islamic University of Gaza, that university is no more. We've seen every university get bombed in Gaza. Yeah. And that knowledge, this level of epistemicide is another thing that we've never, ever seen before. There's so many multiple layers of unprecedentedness when it comes to what has happened there. What were your thoughts when you saw this university after university just being destroyed?
Yeah, well, September was a pretty special time. So in September, the medical students have their graduation. And so there's a concert hall at Islamic University in Gaza City where the medical students have their graduation. There's usually several hundred family members that are there, celebrating with their graduate students, medical students that graduate. I was there for the graduation ceremony and actually sitting with one of the ex-deans. I was sitting next to him, and a good friend of mine, actually the head of the Palestine Medical Council, was sitting on the other side. And we were there during this ceremony, which was absolutely beautiful. It's a beautiful concert, beautiful hall. At the end of this ceremony, the president of the university who actually had spent some time studying at the University of Toronto. So we connected and chatted a little bit. And we were chatting a little bit, and then I eventually came home. Now, interesting part of that story is that the dean of the medical school has had 9 of his family members killed. The first dean of that medical school, Dr. Omar Frawana, who was actually one of the first doctors I ever met in 2013, he and his wife were both killed early in November.
I'm so sorry.
And the president of the university, he himself was also killed. So it's yes, the university was destroyed, but it's also experts who could be teaching and providing knowledge for decades are killed, right? So the physical structure of the university can be reconstructed, and that concert hall is now completely destroyed. That area is destroyed. The whole university is destroyed. I think it's a huge reflection of the resilience of the Palestinian people, though, that in my communications with Dr. Anwar, who's the dean of the medical school at Islamic University, he, despite the obvious suffering that he's experienced with Israel murdering, 9 of his family members, despite that, he's still working. The medical students now, all of them have found their classes. Largely, it's been moving to online. The clinical placements in hospitals, they've been desperately trying to get the students to continue their medical studies. Many of them, I'm sure, will have delays. Many of them will graduate, 6 months or maybe even 9 months later than normal. But it's a testament to their resilience and their determination that most of the students are back studying in one way or another, right? It's
What's
truly
it going to
remarkable.
take? What's it going to take to rebuild this healthcare system? I mean, I know that this fighting needs to stop immediately. The bombardment needs to stop. But what will it take to rebuild?
Yeah. So, I mean, normally in the humanitarian sector, when we talk about a humanitarian response, it's usually in the order of months or a couple of years, right? And we can think about, if a tsunami or hurricane hits, there's a finite period of time where infrastructure is destroyed, systems are broken, the threat is done, right? Like the weather event is done, and then you rebuild, and that's it, right? But here, this is very different, right? You're not talking simply about a moment of time. You're talking about over 10 months of ongoing, uninterrupted destruction of hospitals, universities, mosques, community centers, schools, everything.
Libraries.
Everything is destroyed, right? So it's you're really thinking about redesigning and reconstructing an entire country from scratch, right? So this is not a 1-month project. This is going to take decades and billions of dollars. As a humanitarian, right, I like to think of things in finite packages where it's like, okay, we're going to do this piece, they're going to do this piece. But Gaza, it's going to be decades and billions of dollars. And that work really can't start until there's a ceasefire. And most of the non-government organizations have said, yeah, we need a ceasefire. And this pause that we're seeing for the polio vaccination campaign, that's not a ceasefire, right? It's, you're giving hundreds of thousands of children in Gaza are needing 2 doses of a polio vaccine about 4 weeks apart. And in between those doses, you're going to have hundreds, if not thousands, of those children killed. Why? Because it's not a ceasefire. Because Israel will continue after that pause, bombing these children, killing these children. The
It's so
reconstruction can't
absurd.
start till this is over, right?
Yeah, it's so absurd. I was speaking to a friend. I was saying, they're giving them the vaccine during this time, and then the bombs fall a couple hours later on them.
Exactly.
It's almost like what are you doing? That's why I say it's so absurd. I mean, it just all of it from start to finish. I mean, we're coming up on 1 year now.
Yeah.
Soon it's going to be 1 year. What is it that weighs on you the most?
I would say the same thing that weighs on me is the same thing that motivates me.
Interesting.
So I'm usually not an angry person. I've been to Gaza enough times that I probably have enough things to be angry about. I mean, as a medic in the Great March of Return, I saw horrific things. I probably should be angry.
I should probably say, but for those who don't know, the Great March of Return happened in 2018, 2019. This is when hundreds of Palestinians decided to peacefully march towards the border, and were met with live bullets, hundreds of people injured, killed. And, this goes towards letting people know that there's this whole notion of like, why can't they just peacefully march? Well, when they do peacefully march, they still get killed. It doesn't matter. Sorry, go ahead.
There's no form of peaceful resistance that people in Gaza have not tried and been violently struck down by Israel. There just simply isn't. And that's the context in which October 7th happened. That's not to condone it, but it's just to provide it with some context, right?
You were saying about what motivates you.
I'll tell you. So when I was in Gaza in September, one of the projects I was working on was developing a international internal medicine program that would expand cooperation with some groups outside of Gaza, but also enhance the training capacity within Gaza. Part of that was also developing a nephrology or kidney medicine training program. The two physicians who were most responsible within Gaza for that, one of them was a nephrologist named Dr. Hammam Allo, brilliant nephrologist who I actually had known for many years. The other one was a internal medicine physician, Dr. Rafat Labad. And so Dr. Hammam Allo's house was bombed and he was killed in November. And a week after, Dr. Rafat Labad was bombed and killed in his home. So, I mean, you ask what motivates me. I'll tell you what motivates me over the last 9 months. It's actually something Dr. Hammam Allo told me. So, because of my previous times going to Gaza, when media in Canada wanted to reach someone within Gaza to provide an interview, they often reached out to me and said, do you have anyone that you can on the ground connect to? And so I would connect. There were a few people, but Dr. Hammam Allo was one. In the very first interview in which Dr. Hammam Allo was interviewed in Canada, his house was bombed. Okay, it was actually not a direct hit. It was actually the house immediately next to his was bombed, but all the windows
still affects, yeah,
all the windows in his house were shattered, and he ended up having to end the interview, sweep up the glass, check on his kids. Everyone was fine in the house, and so after that, he actually came back and he finished the interview, and that was his first interview. And after that, I talked to him and I said, look, like, I understand that you wanted to do this interview. I set it up. I obviously feel very guilty. Like, I set this up, and the very first interview you did, your house was bombed. Maybe we should rethink this. Maybe, there's a different way that we can have your voice heard, or maybe you don't need to do this at all. All right. Maybe you can focus on taking care of your patients instead. And he said, no. He said, absolutely no. If the world knew that this was happening, they would make it stop. That's what he said.
I wish that was true.
And so literally every day after that, I said, okay, well, if that's what we need, then I will put you on every single media group that's willing to listen to you. Absolutely, we'll do it. He did an interview with Democracy Now! And it was soon after. I would get a message from him every day on WhatsApp. And you know how WhatsApp, you get one tick if you send it, two if
Yes.
they receive it.
Yeah.
It changes color if they read it. So because of the time change, I would usually text, and then when I woke up in the morning, I would have that second tick from him. And there were a couple days when he would go to work and it was too unsafe to come home, so he wouldn't actually, it might take a day to get the tick. But I sent the message, and it was one tick when I woke up. A little bit unusual, but it had happened before. The second day was one tick. It's like, oh, that's a little unusual. The third day, one of his colleagues called me and told me that he had been killed.
This is following the Democracy Now! Interview.
Yeah.
So basically, I mean, we've seen this with other people that were in Gaza. Rafat al-Arir, for instance, the professor, English literature professor, poet. Whenever they would speak out, it seemed like they were targeted and killed by Israel.
Yeah, and Hammam had been doing nothing but speaking out from day one. Every opportunity that we could get, he was doing that. And to him, that was the most important thing. And so when I think, like, what's motivated me in the last 10 months to speak up and to put myself at risk, it's that. It's knowing that literally you have people who are working every single day there who want nothing more than the world to know and are willing to put themselves at risk, who are still going to work, who are, to them, us speaking up is important. They see it. And this genocide is not going to end if we're quiet.
I understand that feeling, because that's what motivates me when I see the journalists there who are risking their lives every day. And I do pause for a second. I think, should I share this? Should I share this child's brain that's hanging off the side of its head? But then I always think they're risking their lives to show the world what's happening. So I do end up sharing it,
Yeah.
Dr. Thomson, thank you so much for speaking with me.
Thank you, Samira, for having me.